There is a very specific, quiet moment of hesitation that millions of Americans experience every single month. It happens right before you adjust the thermostat in your hallway, or when you stand at the gas pump, watching the digital numbers spin faster than they ever have before. For decades, energy was simply the invisible background noise of the American dream. It was a basic utility, cheap, abundant, and completely ignorable. You paid the bill, and you lived your life. But recently, that background noise has turned into a deafening roar. You haven't bought a larger house. You aren't driving a different route to work. Your family's consumption habits haven't drastically changed. Yet, the financial cost to simply power your existing life has quietly surged, swallowing the raises and bonuses you worked years to earn. Most people believe this is just a temporary wave of inflation, a geopolitical hiccup that will eventually smooth out so prices can return to normal. But the uncomfortable truth is that normal is a baseline we have already left behind. What we are experiencing isn't a temporary price spike, but the permanent, structural repricing of what it costs to simply exist in modern society. Let's look past the comforting narratives offered by evening news anchors and financial columnists. We are constantly reassured that inflation has cooled, that global supply chains have successfully untangled, and that the broader economy is steadily normalizing. But when you examine the raw, unfiltered data of what it actually costs to run a standard American household in 2026, the charts do not show a return to any recognizable baseline. Between 2019 and today, the trajectory of residential energy costs has fundamentally detached from general wage growth. Back in 2019, a middle-class family could expect to spend a predictable, almost forgettable percentage of their take-home pay on electricity, natural gas, and transportation fuel. Fast forward to 2026, and those same households are staring at utility costs that have surged relentlessly. In vast stretches of Middle America, where driving is mandatory and seasonal weather demands heavy heating and cooling, the baseline cost of simply existing has quietly doubled. The math of the modern utility bill has been methodically rewritten while we were distracted by broader economic headlines. If you scrutinize the detailed breakdown of the document that arrives in your mailbox, you will notice a deeply unsettling trend. The actual cost of the energy you consume, the generation charge, is only one fraction of the total equation. The true financial hemorrhage is hiding in plain sight within the transmission, distribution, and fixed infrastructure fees. Utility companies across the country are currently executing one of the most expensive grid overhauls in modern history. They are attempting to harden infrastructure against extreme weather, upgrade aging substations, and manage a chaotic transition between legacy power plants and newer energy sources. The legal structure of regulated utility monopolies guarantees that every single dollar of this multi-billion-dollar transition, alongside a legally protected profit margin, is passed directly onto the captive consumer. You are no longer merely paying for the electricity required to cool your living room or run your appliances. You are being forced to personally finance the structural rebuilding of the entire national grid. And this mandatory utility subscription fee is entirely immune to your personal conservation efforts. You can upgrade your insulation, lower your thermostat, and turn off every light in your home, yet the base cost of simply maintaining a connection to the system will continue to erode your monthly budget. But the invisible grip of this energy squeeze extends far beyond the physical boundaries of your property line. Energy is the master resource of the modern world. It is the hidden variable embedded in the cost of absolutely everything we consume. Consider the grocery store, an environment that seems entirely disconnected from the electric meter attached to the side of your house. Modern commercial agriculture is essentially a massive industrial process of turning fossil fuels into consumable calories. Natural gas is the primary, indispensable feedstock required to produce the synthetic chemical fertilizers that currently dominate our entire food system. When the structural baseline cost of energy permanently shifts upward, the economic viability of this chemical-dependent farming model begins to fracture. The financial cost to synthesize agricultural inputs and maintain artificial soil fertility skyrockets. That massive overhead is then efficiently passed down the supply chain until it lands precisely on your dinner plate. You are paying this new elevated energy tax every time you purchase basic groceries, long before you ever pull up to a gas station. The entire physical architecture of the American middle-class lifestyle was mathematically predicated on one highly fragile assumption: that energy would always remain cheap, abundant, and entirely invisible. But what happens when that fundamental assumption collapses for the very people who followed all the rules, only to find themselves locked inside a geographic footprint they can no longer afford to power? To truly grasp the mechanics of this silent crisis, we must look at the exact financial anatomy of a modern household. Meet Arthur, a 48-year-old regional logistics coordinator living in a sprawling, typical subdivision just outside of the Midwestern city limits. His home, a two-story build from 2006, features high-vaulted ceilings, large windows, and a generous footprint. For a long time, it stood as a definitive monument to his arrival in the American middle class. Arthur's financial architecture represents the exact demographic that this system relies upon. He earns an annual salary of $94,000, a number that historically signaled robust financial security. After the mandatory deductions for federal taxes, his family's health insurance premiums, and a basic retirement contribution, roughly $5,700 lands in his checking account at the beginning of each month. Back in 2019, the carrying cost of his physical existence was comfortably balanced. His commute to the distribution center requires driving 35 highway miles each way, and his large home demands constant, aggressive climate control against brutal winters and sweltering summers. In those days, filling his gas tank and paying the local utility company combined for an expense of around $400 a month. It was merely background noise in his ledger. Today, Arthur has not made a single irresponsible financial decision. He hasn't taken on reckless consumer debt, and he hasn't moved to a more extravagant zip code. He simply continued to exist in the exact same physical coordinates, driving the same route, and keeping his thermostat at the same modest temperature. Yet, the cost of maintaining those specific coordinates has violently mutated. The math he confronts at his kitchen table late at night is cold and unforgiving. From his $5,700 net income, $12,600 immediately vanishes to cover his mortgage, which has been artificially swollen by aggressively reassessed property taxes and localized climate insurance premiums. His vehicles, an absolute survival requirement in a transitless suburban landscape, drain another $850 for monthly payments and basic coverage. Then comes the permanent energy toll. Gasoline to perform his mandatory 70-mile daily round trip now steadily consumes $350 a month. His home utility bill, now heavily loaded with grid-hardening fees, transmission upgrades, and peak demand pricing, averages a staggering $600. That is $950 effectively set on fire every single month, just to maintain basic forward motion and a habitable indoor temperature. The squeeze continues at the grocery store. His monthly food bill now demands $1,150, a cost intrinsically tied to the energy markets through the diesel required for transport, and the natural gas heavily used to synthesize commercial soil additives and chemical fertilizers. When you subtract these structural operating costs, Arthur is left with a functional surplus of exactly $0. He is operating at a silent, rolling deficit. The money required for unexpected medical copays, essential home maintenance, or replacing a worn-out appliance simply does not exist in the cash flow. The truly unsettling realization for Arthur isn't just his shrinking bank account, but the dawning awareness of his own physical confinement within an outdated infrastructure. The grand foyer of his home, with its two-story ceiling, no longer feels like an architectural luxury. It is a thermodynamic liability that requires expensive natural gas to heat. The sprawling, chemically treated lawn he used to maintain with pride now demands costly, energy-intensive synthetic inputs and relentless watering just to avoid neighborhood association fines. His entire physical environment feels like a trap. He is a captive customer in a monopoly system of survival. If he wants to keep his logistics job, he must buy the heavily taxed fuel. If he wants his family to survive the shifting seasons, he must pay the utility monopoly whatever delivery rate they legally negotiated with the state commission. There is no opting out, and there is no cutting back enough to outpace the rising floor of these fixed costs. But to understand why Arthur's quiet desperation is not an isolated anomaly, we must pull back from this single suburban street and examine the ruthless, macro-level mechanics driving this permanent squeeze. To understand why Arthur is trapped, we have to look far beyond his suburban driveway and examine the capital markets. The financial world is currently executing a massive, unprecedented reallocation of wealth. We are living inside what energy economists quietly refer to as the transition gap. Trillions of dollars in institutional investment have systematically withdrawn from legacy energy infrastructure. Funding for new oil refineries, traditional baseload power plants, and expansive pipeline networks has rapidly evaporated. Capital has aggressively pivoted toward renewable technologies, driven by long-term risk models and a global mandate to decarbonize. But a structural mismatch has quietly formed beneath the surface. We have aggressively throttled the expansion of the old energy system before the new energy system is physically capable of carrying the baseload of modern society. Wind and solar, while critical, currently lack the massive grid-scale battery storage required to guarantee absolute stability during peak demand or extreme weather events. This creates a permanent, structural scarcity. When you constrict the supply of reliable, dispatchable energy while the societal demand remains rigid, you do not just get a temporary price spike. You establish an entirely new, elevated price floor that dictates the cost of every physical action in the economy. At the exact same time, the physical wires that deliver this energy are aging and failing. Across the country, utility monopolies are facing catastrophic liabilities from wildfires, devastating winter freezes, and decades of deferred maintenance. They are now spending hundreds of billions of dollars to harden the grid, bury power lines, and upgrade critical substations. Here is the mechanical reality of a regulated utility monopoly. They do not absorb the cost of these massive infrastructure upgrades out of the goodness of their hearts, nor do they cut their dividend payouts to shareholders. By law, they are permitted to pass 100% of these capital expenditures directly onto the consumer, alongside a guaranteed risk-free rate of return. This is why your utility bill is surging even when you turn the lights off. You are not simply buying electricity anymore. You are involuntarily financing the physical reconstruction of the American power grid. Your monthly bill has quietly transformed into a mandatory infrastructure tax, heavily weighted toward fixed delivery charges that you simply cannot escape through personal conservation. But the most insidious layer of this structural squeeze is completely invisible to the average consumer. Energy is the absolute prerequisite for the modern agricultural complex. The food system we rely upon is entirely dependent on fossil fuels, not just for transportation, but as the foundational feedstock for synthetic fertilizers. For decades, industrial agriculture has treated soil simply as a physical medium to hold crops, relying heavily on cheap, energy-intensive chemical inputs to force high yields. But as the structural cost of energy establishes a new baseline, the financial viability of farming with synthetic, petroleum-based fertilizers begins to collapse. Decades of heavy chemical use have depleted the soil of its natural biological vitality, leaving the entire agricultural system hopelessly addicted to these expensive artificial inputs. When the energy required to manufacture these chemical inputs becomes structurally expensive, the cost of growing every single calorie skyrockets. You are paying this compounded energy tax at the grocery checkout line. The price of basic vegetables is no longer just a reflection of weather or labor. It is a direct function of the global natural gas market and a fundamentally broken, input-heavy agricultural model. The physical environment we built, our homes, our food systems, our sprawling suburbs, was entirely predicated on the assumption of infinite, cheap energy. Now, as that assumption structurally fails, the resulting financial pressure doesn't just empty our bank accounts, it begins to fundamentally rewire our nervous systems and alter our psychological reality. This structural squeeze does more than just deplete a checking account. It systematically erodes the human nervous system. When the most basic requirements for survival, heat, light, and mobility, become sources of unpredictable financial trauma, the body enters a state of chronic, low-level physiological stress. This isn't the acute adrenaline of a sudden emergency. It is the corrosive drip of cortisol that comes from a life of permanent hypervigilance. Psychologists recognize this as decision fatigue on a survival scale. For someone like Arthur, every minor action is now filtered through a lens of energy anxiety. The simple act of turning on a space heater or driving an extra 5 miles to a cheaper grocery store requires a complex mental calculation. When your brain is forced to spend its cognitive resources on the base layers of Maslow's hierarchy, your capacity for long-term planning, creativity, and emotional connection begins to wither. This creates a phenomenon known as scarcity brain. When the mind is preoccupied with the shrinking margins of the present, the future becomes an abstract luxury you can no longer afford to contemplate. You stop saving for a 10-year horizon because you are bracing for next month's utility adjustment. You stop investing in new skills or career pivots because the risk of losing your current, energy-dependent stability feels catastrophic. You are, in every sense, becoming cognitively paralyzed by the infrastructure you live in. The escalation of this stress is particularly toxic for the American middle class because it carries the heavy weight of perceived personal failure. We have been culturally conditioned to believe that if the math doesn't work, it is because we are not working hard enough or spending wisely enough. We blame ourselves for the price of the delivery fee on our electric bill. We feel a sense of shame at the gas pump, as if our mandatory commute were a lifestyle indulgence rather than a structural requirement. This internalized blame masks the reality that the squeeze is systemic, not individual. As the cost of the subscription to survival rises, it strips away the primary psychological benefit of middle-class life, the feeling of agency. When your raises are swallowed by grid-hardening fees before they even hit your bank account, you lose the sense that your effort correlates with your progress. You are running faster and faster just to stay in the exact same place, a state of existence that eventually leads to a profound, societal-scale burnout. We are witnessing the emergence of a locked-in generation. These are people who are not poor by traditional metrics, yet they possess no functional freedom. They are the owners of assets they cannot afford to maintain, and the holders of jobs they cannot afford to leave, all while being tethered to an energy grid that views them as a guaranteed revenue stream for its own reconstruction. The physical world is becoming a series of toll booths, and the price to pass through each one is determined by forces that are entirely indifferent to the human beings caught in the middle. As this realization sinks in, the question is no longer about when prices will return to normal, but about what kind of society remains when the cost of simply being normal is no longer a price most people can pay. We often speak of economic crises in the past tense, as singular events with a beginning, a middle, and a definitive end. We look for the stock market crash, the bank failure, or the sudden surge in unemployment lines. But the structural squeeze of the energy transition doesn't offer that kind of theatrical closure. It is not a sudden explosion. It is a slow, steady loss of pressure. It is a quiet transformation of the American landscape from a place of upward mobility into a collection of high-cost silos. The houses, the cars, and the suburbs we built weren't just buildings and machines. They were a set of promises made during an era of cheap, invisible power. Now that those promises have expired, we are left to navigate a world where the floor is rising faster than we can climb. We find ourselves in a strange, liminal space. We are surrounded by the physical symbols of wealth, the large homes, the paved driveways, the multi-car garages, while feeling an increasing sense of internal scarcity. The math of the 20th century is no longer solving the problems of the 21st. Ultimately, energy is not just a commodity we trade on an exchange. It is the measure of our ability to change our environment, to move through the world, and to choose our own future. When energy becomes structurally expensive, it is not just our bank accounts that shrink, it is our world that grows smaller. The question we must eventually face isn't how we can force the old system to return. That door has already closed. The real question is, what does it mean to be a society when the very things that once defined our success, our homes, our mobility, our independence, have become the very things we can no longer afford to sustain? As you turn off the lights tonight and lock your front door, the silence isn't just the absence of sound. It is the weight of a system that is still moving, still calculating, and still demanding its due long after you've gone to sleep.